Hello again, class, and welcome to our presentation, The Social Gospel and Introduction. So in this presentation, we are going to define what is meant by the social gospel movement. We'll talk about two major social gospel movement figures, Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. We will review some conclusions, and then we will talk about what happened to the social gospel movement. So what is the social gospel? So the social gospel refers to the late 19th to early 20th century American Christian religious movement that emphasizes political and economic justice as the central tenet of Christianity. That is, for social gospelers, the purpose of Christianity is to redeem society. How? By cleansing society of social sin through economic and political reform, by creating a new society of perfect justice to bring the kingdom of God to earth, and by reforming humanity and preparing it for the coming of the heavenly kingdom. In other words, the main thesis of the social gospel movement is the following. The key to human salvation is social salvation. And as Washington Gladden writes, the end of Christianity is twofold, a perfect man and a perfect society. These purposes are never separated, they cannot be separated. No man can be redeemed and saved alone. No community can be reformed and elevated save as the individuals of which it is composed are regenerated. So for people like Washington Gladden and the other social gospelers, human salvation depends upon social salvation. So if you want to reform humanity, if you want to reform the individual, you must reform society first. And that is the central thesis of Christianity. Now, one other small detail, the social gospel movement is considered to be a social movement of optimism, meaning social gospelers were optimistic about humanity's desire to be moral and to support socioeconomic reform. Now, arguably, this optimism resulted in the social gospel's early success, but we can also argue that this optimism also led to its downfall, which we will talk about later. So with this in mind, let's take a look at two of the most prominent figures of the social gospel movement, Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. So Washington Gladden was born in Pottsgrove, Pennsylvania in 1836. He is a congregational pastor, writer, and activist, and served most of his career in Massachusetts and Ohio, initially preaching to the business class, but later became involved in union advocacy and protest movements. Now for Gladden, what is the greatest social sin? Because remember, social gospelers are concerned with the sins of society as a whole. Well, for Gladden, there are two: the exploitation of workers by the industrial capitalist system and predatory competition. So in other words, industrial capitalism and competition, he believes, run contrary to Christian principles. So how is society to be reformed? Well, for Gladden, you must preach to the entrepreneurial class, the business class, on how to be a good Christian employer. He also supported certain initiatives like profit sharing for the wage-receiving class, and he also supported the existence of unions to fight for the rights of workers. And what is the ideal society for Washington Gladden? A Christianized form of democratic capitalism. In other words, Gladden wanted to keep the system of capitalism in place in America, but he wanted to basically reform the system with Christian principles of charity, fairness, and selfless love. Now, our second figure is Walter Rauschenbusch, and he was born in Rochester, New York in 1861. He was a Baptist pastor, professor, and theologian. And he became influenced by the social gospel movement while serving at an impoverished church in Manhattan. Now, like Washington Gladden, Walter Rauschenbusch argued that the greatest social sin is once again the exploitation of workers by the industrial capitalist system, as well as predatory competition. So how is society to be reformed according to Rauschenbusch? Well, for him, American society needs to be completely restructured and Christianized, meaning the restructuring of values in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount or the teachings of Jesus. In other words, society must be reformed and Christianized in accordance with Jesus' moral teachings. And as Rauschenbusch writes, we do not want less religion, we want more. But it must be a religion that gets its orientation from the kingdom of God. To concentrate our efforts on personal salvation or on soul culture comes close to refined selfishness. All of us who have been trained in egotistic religion need a conversion to Christian Christianity, even if we are bishops or theological professors. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and God's righteousness and the salvation of your souls will be added to you. So for Rauschenbusch, Christianity itself needs to be reformed so that it is not about individual salvation but social salvation. And once Christianity is reformed, it can go about reforming society. And for Rauschenbusch, what is the ideal reformed society? A democratic socialist republic. Well, what is that? For Rauschenbusch, a democratic socialist republic is a society in which, 1, citizens are granted voting rights as in any democracy, but there is an equal distribution of rights and material resources to all citizens, and there is cooperative ownership or a kind of democratic ownership by the workers of the means of production, meaning that the workers own the factories. So as we can see, this is kind of a blend between democracy and socialism. So in conclusion, put simply, whereas Washington Gladden wanted to reform the American capitalist society with Christian principles, Walter Rauschenbusch wanted to completely dismantle the capitalist system, replacing it with a Christianized form of democratic socialism. So whereas Gladden believed that capitalism could be reformed so that it was kind of more in tune with Christian teachings, Rauschenbusch believed that capitalism simply is not compatible with capitalism, that indeed socialism is actually more compatible with Christian belief. Now, what happened to the social gospel movement? Why don't we really hear about it much today? Well, the social gospel movement gradually declined after the First and Second World Wars. Okay, why? Well, the theory is that Americans no longer felt optimistic about the human desire for morality and social progress. That is, after the first 2 world wars, people in the West just became more cynical about human nature and were just not as optimistic about the human drive to do good. And therefore, the social gospel just fell out of favor. However, despite its decline, many of the central tenets of the social gospel movement profoundly influenced later Christian social movements such as the civil rights movement, Christian socialism, as well as both Roman Catholic and Protestant flavors of liberation theology.